sat down to write the script for this final video in my By Now trilogy series on last March's Mass Effect Andromeda, I had a single purveying thought around which I wanted to centralise the video. It was nothing profound, probably nothing that hasn't been said before, but I felt it made sense to base the theme of this final video on that thought. Before I carry on, I'm issuing a spoiler warning right here and right now. This video will most likely spoil a great deal of the plot for Andromeda, as well as the plot of the original trilogy. If you haven't played any of the games, I have to wonder what on earth you're doing here. If you haven't played Andromeda, I recommend you give it a try, just to get a feel for how this is going to play out. And lastly, if you haven't played the original trilogy, I would implore you to do so. So, with that out of the way, let me tell you the thought that inspired this script. I enjoyed playing Mass Effect Andromeda, but did not enjoy the experience of Andromeda. By contrast, I enjoyed both playing and experiencing the original trilogy, and more specifically, I greatly enjoyed experiencing the second and third games in an almost equal capacity. As I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, the Mass Effect series is my all-time favourite video game series. It boasts some of the strongest, most emotional writing I've ever experienced, with a memorable cast of characters and some of the best written, most engaging story sequences of any video game I have ever played. I adore the games so much that when my younger sister expressed even the slightest interest in them, I went out and bought all 3 games for her, and sat down and watched her play through them all for almost 60 hours in total. I watched her go from happy-go-lucky, shooting everything that moved and chatting up Tali'Zorah at every opportunity, to a slack-jawed, wide-eyed mess when the game stopped her in her tracks for the first time and said, "Choose." None of that happened with Andromeda. There was never a moment where I felt like the weight of my choices were pressing on my shoulders. There was no gut-wrenching horror as I heard the resolute disappointment in a teammate's voice when I left them behind. There's no time given for investment and no reason to care. You're plunged in at the deep end with a bunch of misfits who have travelled 600 years to escape the threat of invasion, and the first thing everyone does is bicker, whinge and wage war with each other. It's safe, contained and cookie-cutter. The Krogans abandoned ship because of course they did. Humanity had to step in and restore order because of course it did. Alec Ryder died and now you're the new Pathfinder because of course you are. The story starts and then never really goes anywhere. For the longest time, nothing happens. And by the time something does happen, it's too late to get invested. You already know that nothing is going to go wrong. You can tell from the look in Andromeda's eye. My experience with Andromeda can be best summed up by comparing it to my experience with Dark Souls 2. The first time through, I loved the game. The second time, the flaws and cracks began to show. Neither Dark Souls 2 nor Andromeda are bad games. What they are bad series games. Dark Souls 2 is a great game that did a lot of things right and improved on the stellar combat of the original, but it is my least favourite game in the franchise. Similarly, Mass Effect Andromeda is not a bad game, not objectively at least. But sadly, it is a bad Mass Effect game. It has the unfortunate burden of being the long-anticipated next instalment in a dearly beloved franchise. A franchise that has burned so many memories into gamers' minds. A franchise that asked you to make impossible choices, to think about what you were doing, to use common sense and tactics to scrape through a suicide mission with all of your team intact. A franchise that saw you take a soldier from the status of laughingstock to galactic saviour. Of course Andromeda was never going to live up to the lofty expectations set by its predecessor. We can't pretend that the original trilogy didn't have problems. Going back and playing the first game now is a struggle at times. The controls are stiff and a little awkward, and the game is incredibly menu heavy, with a whole lot of time spent faffing about in the equipment screens turning stuff to mush. Still, it has the luxury of being a decade old, and rose-tinted glasses can be quite the blinders. If I'm honest, as a total nerd who owns all 3 games on all 3 sensible consoles, I'd have to place my cards on the PS3 version being the best. The original Mass Effect was a 360 exclusive at the time and wasn't released on the PS3 until the second game was already well over a year old. It was rebuilt in Mass Effect 2's engine and it both looks and feels so much better for us. If I had to push one platform to play these games on, I'd have to be a console peasant and urge you to play them on PS3. For the sake of ease, what you're seeing now is entirely PC footage, but the last time I replayed the first game, I did so on console. The improvements were drastic. It's difficult for me to be subjective about the first game's release because back in 2007 I was far too busy studying for my exams and playing 5-year-old GameCube games to care much for the Xbox 360. I vaguely remember hearing about it, but I didn't play the original game until almost 3 years later after the release of the second. I remember finishing the first game on a Friday night, staring at the screen as the credits rolled, and rushing out from my tiny university hall's bedroom the next morning, trailblazing down to the nearest game store and grabbing the first copy of Mass Effect 2 that I could find. Predictably, my first run of the second game was a total disaster. If I recall correctly, I believe I survived with about 5 members of my crew left. Good times were had all around. Objectively, Mass Effect was released around the time that first-person shooters were starting to take control of the market. Gears of War led the way the year before, and was quickly followed by Medal of Honor Vanguard, Bioshock, The Darkness, and the beginning of the end, Modern Warfare. September saw Halo 3 release to extreme fanfare, whilst titles like Persona 3 and Heavenly Sword quietly sleeper-hit their way into gaming history. Assassin's Creed emerged from the ashes of Prince of Persia, and Nathan Drake stormed into the annals of history in Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. By and large, there was no place for a quietly contemplative space opera with mature, sincere writing and intriguing, genuine characters. On the 20th of November 2007, Mass Effect was released alongside titles like Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, Trauma Center, Rock Band, and Soul Calibur Legends. The day before, Uncharted had been released, and just 3 days before that, Assassin's Creed had arrived. 3 titles, each to spawn a highly successful series, each with their own pros and cons, each to become powerhouses of their genre. But only one was unique, and only one managed to balance its gameplay and narrative in a way that was not merely functional, but enjoyable. It became an experience. I played Mass Effect at the height of a time when I had gone from having very little money to suddenly having way too much. I went to university with just 2 consoles and about 20 games, and went home at the end of my first year with a further 2 consoles and about 100 games. Amongst the first slew of games that I bought for the 360 were Fallout 3, World at War, Army of Two, and some other gems lost to the depths of my memory. Mass Effect was the game that struck a chord with me, that left an impression on me for a long, long time afterwards. I've said before that I like a good story, and that's a half-truth. Fact is, I adore good stories. It doesn't have to be anything special or even brand new, as long as it's engaging, with interesting and well-written characters and a comprehensible plot, I can be invested. The world of Mass Effect was absolutely engaging from the word go. I had never played anything like it, nothing so grand and theatrical, nothing that truly encompassed the word epic. Space opera video games, and especially RPG science fiction, are quite rare these days. Games like Mass Effect are even rarer, whether it's because there's no real market for them or because it's a genre that seems to have its roots very firmly planted in RTS. Science fiction games set in an expanded galaxy just aren't that common, which is a shame because games of this calibre are my enduring love. There are plenty of sci-fi games, sure, games like Deus Ex, Perfect Dark, Half-Life, Portal, but there aren't many sci-fi space opera games quite as embellished and believable as Mass Effect. It is a legacy that is unfortunately a heavy burden for Andromeda to bear. There will never be a moment quite like that opening sequence of Mass Effect 2. This is one of the few video game intros that takes my breath away every time I play it, like seeing Rapture for the first time or finally coming face to face with Artorias the Abyss Walker. The first time I saw this introduction, as I stepped through the doors into the sudden silence of space and saw a planet looming overhead, I knew I was in for an amazing experience. Mass Effect 2 didn't gel with absolutely everyone. It is one of the highest rated video games of all time with a Metacritic score of 96 for the Xbox 360 version, although I'd argue the slight improvements to its engine make the PS3 version superior. Still, there were fans of the hardcore RPG aspects of the original game who were displeased with the decision to strip out a lot of those elements, and I can understand that. The combat was much more simplified, a lot easier to run and gun, and whilst it was streamlined in a sensible way to match the frantic pace of its race against time plot, I can see where the criticisms were coming from. Even so, there's nothing quite so astounding to me as spending the first 30 minutes of a game in which its prequel let you build up the rapport of your Commander Shepard, watching them die so suddenly and viciously. It was a spectacular opening, and it remains to this day one of the few intro sequences in a game that never, for me, feels arduous or tutorialised. There are flaws, that I will concede. The planet scanning aspect of the game was horrifically slow in the original Xbox release. Even upgrading it barely made it better. In fact, the upgraded planet scanning speed was about the same as the base speed in the PS3 and PC versions of the game. It was an interesting idea that was executed poorly, though to my mind it is the only aspect of the game that deserves to be singled out for its shoddy nature relative to the rest of the game. The way it flowed into and informed the gameplay was far more interesting, with the game genuinely punishing players for choosing not to upgrade their ship or their allies' abilities, hence the reason why my first attempt ended in disaster. It takes a little common sense and some obvious tactics to save everyone in the final mission of the game, but good God does it feel like a fantastic achievement when you do. This was a game where your choices actually mattered. There are very few games, especially in a market currently oversaturated with companies trying desperately to be the next big emotional draw, that manage to actually make your time worth the investment. For the most part, it's a thinly veiled disguise, an illusion of choice. Not so in Mass Effect 2. And this, unfortunately, was not a sensibility that carried over to Mass Effect 3. Don't get me wrong, there are absolutely decisions in Mass Effect 3 that affected the grand scheme of things, and choices from previous games could come back to haunt you. Sadly, the game's 95% unyielding, relentlessly stellar nature was almost entirely destroyed by its original ending. Now, I have to be frank, I never saw the original ending of Mass Effect 3 until I googled it out of morbid curiosity about a year ago. Back in the day, so long ago that it was actually around the time that Game in the UK almost went bust, if anyone remembers that, I was playing Mass Effect 3 on the 360. I poured my heart and soul into it for hours on end. I had even completely replayed Mass Effect 2 to get the best possible ending before doing so. Then, one fateful day, the game updated and was promptly corrupted. I couldn't finish the game. I couldn't even proceed past the main menu. Uninstalling it did nothing. It was dead and there was nothing that I could do. Angry and embittered, I removed the disc and gave up hope of ever finishing, not knowing that I was just 2 missions away from the conclusion. It wasn't until the PS3 release of the original game, almost 9 months after the final installment's release, that I was able to complete the series. By that point, the extended cut DLC had been released, greatly embellishing Mass Effect 3's ending, and it was one of the first things I downloaded after sprinting to the shop to buy PS3 copies of the second and third games. Over the Christmas period of 2012, I poured 80 hours into them, seeing and doing everything, and at last, on the morning of the 26th of December 2012, I saw the ending. I was not disappointed. No doubt had I finished it earlier before the DLC was released, and if my 360 hadn't decided to spare me the torment, I would have been. I likely wouldn't be telling this story now. But by the good grace of my console's spectacular foresight, I witnessed the end of the game in a manner that, whilst not perfect, was certainly a lot better than a choice of coloured lights. Mass Effect 3 is not a perfect game. It deserves the criticism it gets for its shoddy ending. But even so, despite the fact that the ending largely made all of your choices meaningless, no one at the time was quite sure as to what they would have preferred. These days there are a fair few fan creations that could have proven far superior, as well as some incredibly well-made mods available that can better the experience, although I have never actually tried them. All of the fan theories had one thing in common: the transparent Star Child was completely ridiculous. So, what could BioWare have done instead? Here's my idea. Let me paint a picture for you. Shepard and Anderson come face to face with the elusive man, by now fully in the throes of indoctrination. You try to talk him down and you either succeed and have him take his own life, realising the futility of his position, or you fail and are forced to shoot him. Either way, Anderson is caught in the crossfire and dies at your side, proud of you. Gravely injured but determined, Shepard stumbles to the console, prepared to enable the Crucible, but there's something stopping it. Somewhere up above, the Crucible's power relays are being drained and scuppered. Shepard is tired and furious. You ascend the lift to the outer shell of the station, where the Crucible's power cells stand. It's lonely and quiet. You can see the war raging beyond the shields, countless human lives sacrificed, countless more aliens dying for the sake of the galaxy. It hardens your resolve. As the lift comes to a halt, you see what is draining the power relays. There, looming above you, is Harbinger, the overwhelming Reaper who toyed with you so greatly throughout the Collector incursion, who seems so determined to bring you down, alone and prepared. Its defences are raised. You have a pistol in hand, a single thermal clip remaining. Harbinger bears down upon you and gloats. We are the vanguard of your destruction. Shepard is tired. You may not survive. Now is the time to make a choice. You can let Harbinger win, try to take it down and fail, or let it complete its indoctrination of Shepard. Give in to the fate of the galaxy. You can sacrifice the Crucible. Destroying the power relay should destroy Harbinger, but you have no idea if this will force a retreat from the Reapers. You just have to hope. You could distract Harbinger long enough to fire the Crucible and hope to God that it works as intended. Or you can find another way. You know the Reapers have a weak spot beneath their plating, vulnerable only when they prime their cannons. You can wait it out, bait an attack. A biotic Shepard could engulf that weak spot in every last ounce of energy they possess. A tech could pour every ounce of their hardware capabilities into overloading the Reaper's systems. A soldier could enshroud their bullets in every possible enhancement and pray it is enough to bring the bastard down. You make your choice. Harbinger falls, and your decision seals the fate of the entire known galaxy. You don't know if Shepard survived, but you choose to believe. A new Mass Effect game was expected practically from the moment ME3 hit the ground running. The backlash from the trilogy's ending, however, seemed to have an unexpected knock-on effect to the plans for the series' continuation, an effect that wouldn't be truly understood until almost 4 years later, when, after a long period of drought, information suddenly poured forth in waves. There was a quiet desperation to the announcement, to the sudden and unexpected arrival of footage, characters, voices and story. It appeared as if from nowhere, and it was met with lukewarm uncertainty. The game lacked something, even in those early days. The optimist in me was quietly intrigued. It must just be the lack of Commander Shepard. The charismatic character we had come to know and love was an attachment too great and too powerful. Shepard was hugely missed, despite the fact that audiences had known from the get-go that the game would not involve the Commander. Still, there was hope. The outpouring of information was unsteady and unsure, but its arrival was still welcome. The problem, as we discovered, is that the Mass Effect games are Commander Shepard. The series was built around the story and eventual legend of Shepard, and they are, unfortunately, inseparable. It was foolish to think that Andromeda could fashion a brand new identity entirely independent from the original trilogy. It's clear from the gameplay and the story that an attempt was made to separate the two, but an awful lot was lost in translation as a result. The charm and tenacity of the trilogy was an endearing aspect of its personality, its wit and character a strong draw, even to those who might not ordinarily choose such a game. Andromeda has character, it has wit and charm and even a touch of personality. The problem is, it doesn't have enough. The reason for this is threefold. Let's start with the simplest. It is a BioWare game. BioWare, especially these days, are typically considered to be a company that produces grand, theatrical, epic games with smart and engaging writing, interesting characters and extraordinary effort. There are exceptions to this rule. Dragon Age 2 certainly didn't have the time it needed for that last little caveat. but for the most part, they can usually be relied upon to provide a superb and engrossing adventure. Titles like Jade Empire, Knights of the Old Republic, and the aforementioned Dragon Age series have rightfully been considered outstanding titles for the effort and devotion poured into their narrative craftwork. BioWare's writers have a talent for creating a character with a particular theme and building a living, breathing person out of them. It's an envious ability, and it's not something that carried over into Andromeda. So Andromeda's first problem is that it is a BioWare game. It has all the hallmarks of one: a grand open-ended adventure, fluid-ish combat, themed-ish characters. It just doesn't do anything with them. More than that, it doesn't really understand what to do with them. Somebody looked at the second game and said, we need that, but better. And then they couldn't figure out how to make it better. If you've played the games, including Andromeda, I want you to do something for me. I'm going to name a character, and I want you to name an aspect of their personality, something that stands out to you. Vetra, Jarl, Liam, Drac, Samara, Jack, Rex, Garrus. Maybe I'm biased, or maybe it's quite obvious that instead of Andromeda having one Caden or Kasumi or James, it has a whole squad full of Cadens and Kasumis and whatever. It has plenty of characters, they just aren't very interesting. Their backgrounds are very similar, their motivations are very similar, everything is just similar. Their personal quests are the only real variance amongst them, otherwise they are primarily grizzled and jaded individuals with family problems and a tendency to act irrationally. Having personality traits does not equate to having a personality, and unfortunately the only character with a real, fully defined personality is Peebee. The likelihood is that the reason for this extreme tilt in her favour is to do with her centralised presence in the game's trailers and marketing, rather than something that was implemented into the game because anybody loved the character. Now, don't get me wrong, the characters aren't wanting for wit and charm when they try, but they just aren't well thought out nor well written. They lack an almost indefinable something, a raison d'etre, as it were. And no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find one. Not for any of the characters. I never felt like there was a reason to want to talk to any of them. And they never tried to distinguish themselves from one another. There was never a moment where I believed that the characters were even interacting with each other, let alone with me. And the complete lack of definition to these simplistic plastic characters is what derails the experience as a character-driven drama. Andromeda's second biggest problem is that it lacks the attention to detail that made so much of the original series spectacular to watch unfold. If you go back and read some of the planet entries in the original games, most notably the first game, you'll see that the entire trilogy was carefully planned and scripted long beforehand. Indications of a Reaper invasion, either thousands of years ago or looming on the horizon, are scattered across the galaxy. They're not integral to the story, but they're there for people who look hard enough. And touches like that make the game so much more memorable. It's a nice reminder that the developers not only cared about the game they were making, but the story they were crafting and its continuity. That dedication is truly admirable. Now, I know what you might be thinking. It's unfair to compare Andromeda, a brand new game and the start of a new trilogy, to a pre-existing series that is now fully complete. And that's a fair comment. But consider the original Mass Effect. Those planet entries I mentioned were written with forethought, with the knowledge of exactly where the developers wanted to take them in the future. They are retrospective Easter eggs that inform not just the game they are in, but the games to come. Even if a sequel had never been made, the biggest difference between Mass Effect and Andromeda is that Mass Effect feels like a complete game. The ending isn't really a cliffhanger. It would be just as easy to say that Saren was the end of it, that no Reaper invasion ever happened without him, that the game just stopped. The fact that it has a sequel is inconsequential to the quality of the original. Mass Effect has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Andromeda doesn't have that. It is 40 hours of a game that is entirely beginning. There's no middle, and there's no end. The game just sort of stops. It feels like a game that was deliberately created to be the start of a franchise, and as a result it feels incomplete. It feels cynical. It has numerous story threads that go nowhere, no wrap-up to half of the species arcs that have gone missing. These were presumably meant to be DLC, but given the game's comparatively poor reception and the backlash from fans, the decision to shelve any DLC was likely made months before the actual announcement proved it in writing. But Andromeda's biggest problem is, quite simply, that it's poorly written. It stinks of developers who had no idea what made the trilogy enjoyable. They knew people liked the Mako, so they made their own version, but fundamentally misunderstood what it was about the Mako that people enjoyed, namely its absurd physics. They knew people liked Garrus, but didn't really know why. They knew people liked Rex, but they didn't really know why. And so the Nomad and Vetra and Drac were born, defined not by their own unique engagements or personalities, but by the weight of their forefathers. Not enough is done to distance them. Not enough is done to make Andromeda Andromeda, instead of just Mass Effect in Andromeda. It does not do enough to justify its own existence. I enjoyed Andromeda, I did, but I enjoyed it as a game, not as an experience, and was constantly plagued by thoughts of how much better it could have been, how poor the writing was, how much was set up and never paid off. I was bothered by shallow choices, shallow characters, and shallow outcomes. Nothing felt like it mattered, and no part of the game ever gave me pause for thought. The very idea of humanity attempting to colonise the Andromeda galaxy should be unthinkable, impossible even, and yet there's never a moment when it feels like the weight of the future is on your shoulders. The characters certainly try to make it look like there's some weight to their decisions and their conversations, but though admirable on occasion, they almost always fail. A lot of this comes down to the reaction you have to a simple question. Why does my choice, right here and right now, matter? For example, why should I care whether or not I decide to kill this Ket commander? What possible reason could I have not to kill her? Why should I care about whether I expose the Asari Pathfinder's lies? What impact does it have on the world, if any? I never felt invested in anything I was doing, but I also never felt that the game I was playing even remotely cared about what was going on within it. Part of this is down to the poor writing, but it's also down to the shoddy animation. Everything except the characters looks pretty decent, the vistas are gorgeous, the design ethic draws an appropriate line between the believability of the original trilogy and technology founded on faith and a whole lot of money, and the enormity of space is conveyed pretty well. The problem is that the characters just don't look invested in what they're saying or doing, and half of the time they don't sound invested either. The voice acting is shocking in places, but then that's what happens when the material you have to work with is less than stellar. Now, I know next to nothing about game design, so I'm not even going to attempt to guess at what happens to the character animation, but I can point you in the direction of a really interesting video by Dan at Extra Credits. He knows a whole lot more than I could even guess at about video game design and animation, and his take on what might have happened to Andromeda is incredibly well informed and enjoyable to watch. I'll pop a link in the description. At the risk of repeating myself, what spoils Andromeda as an experience is not the low quality animations, the occasional technical issues, the patchy writing, or even the forgettable characters. What spoils it is that, like Thief, the reboot in 2014, like DMC Devil May Cry, the reboot, it is a fundamental misunderstanding of its source material, and despite its best efforts, like many sequels shoddy or otherwise before it, it is both impossible and impractical to entirely distance Andromeda from its forefathers. The trilogy presented a platform that this game could have used as a springboard, and damn it if it didn't try. The problem is that it sprang from that board straight into an empty pool. At the end of the day, like Dragon Age 2, Final Fantasy 13, or every Call of Duty game since Modern Warfare 3, Mass Effect Andromeda is not an experience, it is a game. At the halfway point in this video, I gave an opinion on how I thought the ending of Mass Effect 3 could have been made better. To do the same for Andromeda, I would need to rewrite the entire thing, and I don't think I have the time for that. There are too many niggling issues, too many things that need fixing. Plot threads that go nowhere, fetch quests, underused side characters, poor dialogue chains, the list goes on. Andromeda is a game with many starts and very few endings. It is a game that has effort put into it, and that is effort that we should not dismiss just on the basis of emotional subjectivity. But it doesn't have enough. What Andromeda needed was more time, and it did not have it. It was announced quite a while ago now that no further single-player DLC would be released for the game. Patches would continue to fix issues with the game if necessary, and regular multiplayer updates would be released. But as it stands, Andromeda is a finished game. And sadly, despite how desperately BioWare and EA are banging on about this not being the end, about how the Mass Effect legacy will continue, I can't help but wonder just how shaky the ground is beneath their feet. At the time of writing, but not at the time of recording, EA had just recently shut down Visceral Studios, creators of Dead Space. A little while previously, they also shut down Maxis, Westwood, Origin, Bullfrog, victims of a fickle industry, victims of a fickle company who want games, not experiences. BioWare are a company founded on experiences. Mass Effect is a series whose legacy is founded on the experience, the ability of the game to place itself in the palm of your hand and whisper, choose. Mass Effect Andromeda is a lesson in consumer desire and publisher pride. Too much faith and weight was placed upon the shoulders of the Mass Effect mantle, weight that should never have been there, and this proved to be the final nail in Andromeda's coffin. What it needed, and what it still needs, is time. Whether that's the 3-year development cycle of Mass Effect 2, combined with Andromeda's 5-year cycle, or the decade that it took to make Final Fantasy XV. Fans were angsty, distraught each time a delay was made or an announcement barely trickled information out, but they would have waited. I would have waited for as long as it took. If the future holds a continuation for the franchise, then I sincerely hope the development team take a good long look at the feedback delivered to them in the aftermath of Andromeda's release. But more than anything, I hope they have the guts to stand up to the publishers and refuse to rush development just to push an unfinished game out of the doors. After all, Shigeru Miyamoto did once suggest that a rushed game will always be bad, but a delayed game will eventually be good. And whilst this isn't true in all cases, it is a quote that understands the fundamentals of crafting not a game, but an experience. Time, effort, and dedication. 3 factors that Andromeda simply didn't have.